Now, before coming to Mahmood Saab, I'll come to Frederick, who's joined us online. Thank you, Frederick, for your patience and for joining us. Frederick, you had the human rights office of Facebook, or the wing of Facebook for Asia Pacific, and you work with the global team. So we're curious to know that, there have been efforts from Meta to sort of follow international law standards. Of course, they're bound by international law. We also have the GNI principles that Meta abides by. And then Meta has its own human rights policy that's been formulated. So in the context of hate speech and disinformation, if you could please shed light on what is the process through which content moderation goes through, especially when it comes to disinformation and hate speech online. And then once you set the stage on that, maybe you can talk about, in-platform efforts where users can report content for disinformation or for hate speech, because we feel that, that regulatory mechanism at the first level is also important rather than relying on state regulatory efforts that obviously take a lot longer. So yeah, over to you, Frederick.
Thank you, Osama. Can you hear me okay? Yes, good.
Yes.
First, I'd just like to say on behalf of Meta, I want to thank you, AGHS, and the other organizers for giving us the opportunity to participate, and to my fellow panelists, and apologize for not being able to be there in person and joining virtually. I very much wish I could be there. As Osama said, my name is Frederick Roski. I'm the head of human rights policy for the Asia Pacific region at Meta and part of a larger human rights policy team. I joined Meta only in July of 2022, so I'm a relative newcomer, following on several decades of international civil society and UN work. That's my background as a human rights lawyer. Just say I'm personally honored to be part of the event. Asma Jahangir has been a role model and inspiration of mine throughout my career as a human rights lawyer. And I'm grateful we were able actually to briefly cross paths when I was at the International Commission of Jurists, where she was commissioner and then honorary commissioner for many years, and was one of those rare individuals that not only made extraordinary contributions to human rights in her own country, but is really played a crucial role in evolving international human rights law and standards, including through her various UN special rapporteur roles. You raised a number of issues, any one of which I could speak on for about 30 minutes. So I will just be very brief. I'll give a little bit of context on the human rights policy and then maybe touch on a couple of the points you raised. And if you'd like me to elaborate, I can do that later. But I did want to start by just saying that Meta has tried very hard to show its commitment to protecting human rights through action and not just assertion. First and foremost among that is the existence of the human rights team, of which I'm a part. And I know Osama and others here, I'm sure, have had contact with myself and other colleagues on the team in various contexts, and adopted a human rights policy. The human rights policy is relatively new. It was established in March of 2021, not so long ago. No policy is perfect, but we're quite proud of the fact that the company has committed to a set of policies that explicitly acknowledges and incorporates international human rights law, including the UN guiding principles. I'm also quite proud of the fact that we've adopted the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, broad and inclusive definition of human rights defender in that policy, which allows us a lot of scope to provide protections and engage with the specific protection issues that human rights defenders, written very broadly, face. In addition to the human rights policy itself, our community standards also incorporate human rights principles, as do other policies, such as misinformation, cybersecurity, election integrity. I'll digress for a second, since you asked about to say a few words about the actual policy and process that we take for assessing hate speech and similar types of speech. Our community standards prohibit a very wide range of potentially harmful content that includes violence and incitement, hate speech, speech from dangerous organizations and individuals. It prohibits various forms of violent and graphic content. And these policies apply to all content shared on Facebook and Instagram, regardless of who posts it, and are informed in various ways by human rights standards and international humanitarian law. We have sought, for instance, to adapt aspects of the Rabat Plan of Action and pool them into various content policy tools and frameworks in order to better evaluate speech attacking people and concepts, content involving state use of force, and a range of other issues. And not everything fits into that framework. I'll be honest. I mean, there are types of content that fall within the cracks or that may violate various policies, and we action in different ways. I'll preempt a possible question, which is in the Pakistan context, a blasphemous or allegedly blasphemous context, content often comes up. And while we don't have a quote unquote policy on blasphemy, we do assess allegedly blasphemous content against that full range of content policies that we have. And in some cases, we will allow content that may even violate those policies if it's newsworthy or if keeping it visible is in the public interest in some way or another. But we only do this after conducting a review that weighs that set of interests against the risk of harm, particularly the risk of physical safety and security. And we do, wherever we can, look to international human rights standards to help make those judgments. Misinformation is slightly different. Misinformation content or alleged misinformation content, we treat in some ways very similarly to other content. We look at it across our full range of community standards to assess whether or not it's violating any of those. If it is, we action it. If it doesn't violate those standards, and it often does, we will most often refer that material to an independent third-party fact checker, for which we have two in Pakistan, actually, or working on Pakistan. And they will make an independent judgment as to whether or not that content constitutes misinformation. And there are a number of tools that come into play if that judgment is made, including labeling, demotion of various kinds, or limitations on the reach of that kind of content. Disinformation, again, a bit different. When it comes to disinformation, we're focused primarily less on content and more on actors. Are these networks of individuals or groups engaging in what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior? Are they coordinated networks to promote misinformation on a particular topic? And we've got another set of policies and teams that work on identifying and investigating those networks and taking them down. So there are a lot of different policies that are implicated in addressing misinformation. And I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail about it. I'll just flag a couple of other more things about the human rights policy. We also engage in kind of advocacy, primarily through multi-stakeholder and industry forums. As Usama mentioned, we are a member of the Global Network Initiative, and we've committed to protecting expression and privacy against overbroad government demands, among other things, as a member. We also promote human rights through private and public advocacy conducted by multi-stakeholder or industry bodies like the Asia Internet Coalition. Flag for you, that coalition has issued a number of statements recently relating to Pakistan, including raising concerns about the human rights potential impacts of various pieces of legislation, as well as raising concerns about the disruption of internet services in Pakistan in the pre-election period. We're also members of the UN Global Compact, and we engage with various UN actors a great deal in that context. Lastly, my team is focused a lot on protection issues, on human rights defenders who will come to us with specific protection issues, either about the integrity of their own presence online or attacks against them, or there'll be a resource for us to help inform our decisions about how we're actioning content, identifying bad actors, understanding whether those bad actors are private, whether they're state-sponsored bad actors, whether they're a mix, and it's a complicated environment. We also run a human rights defender fund through an international organization called the Civil Rights Defenders, which gives emergency assistance to human rights defenders. I think we've now given assistance to about 500, largely in South and and Southeast Asia. And last but not least, I won't go into it because we've got that expertise here on the panel, but the Oversight Board is also an integral part of our kind of human rights governance and framework. And the fact that the Oversight Board has adopted international human rights as fundamental to its own decision-making process is a very influential factor for us, excuse me. And many of those cases focus on how to find that correct balance between freedom of speech and safety, and to appropriately assess the context in which these things happen. And the board has recently delivered a decision on Pakistan as well, in which it upheld a decision by Meta to leave up a post that included the video of a speech before the Parliament of Pakistan, but also offered a set of other recommendations about how Meta can refine and improve upon its policies. I'll stop there, but happy to go into more detail if it's of interest into, for instance, how we assess and evaluate requests of government and others regarding specific piece of content, or other aspects of what I've said. So thank you. And once again, very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in the conference.
No, thank you for that helpful overview, Frederick. It's interesting, the politician whose speech that Oversight Board dealt with was actually speaking in the previous session right here at the conference. So this conference really does bring everyone together. You spoke about demotion of content, and in the current context, it reminded me, and I'm sure the audience is very curious also, how does the demotion, or colloquially it's called shadow banning, work? Because especially in the context of the Israel and Palestine conflict currently, a lot of people are complaining that when they post about Gaza or genocide or Israel, they're seeing that their posts aren't visible to everyone. And I know Meta has issued reports on this, and Meta has also done impact assessment, human rights due diligence and impact assessment on the Israel-Palestine issue. So maybe if you could shed a bit of light on how that policy works, and what should people expect? Should they not talk about the genocide on Meta platforms, or what is it that's obstructing their reach to their followers?
Thank you, Osama. So my last remark was really more in relation to how we might treat differently content that's not violating our policies in any way, but has been assessed by independent third-party fact checkers as misinformation. In those cases, what I was trying to make note of is that we wouldn't block that content, but would rather label it, direct users to some fact-checking resources, and we would then not promote that content in the same way that normal, what we call organic content would be promoted. And I'm no expert in the operation of that process myself, but the intent being to limit or slow the reach of material that a third-party independent fact checker has determined to be suspect. When it comes to disinformation more broadly, where we've established that there are bad actors using inauthentic means to promote inaccurate information, then we action those networks rather than look at individual pieces of content. As for Israel, Palestine, and Gaza, I'm reluctant to get into great detail on it because I'm not the right person to speak to it. But I can say a few things, which is that we do not seek to block pro-Palestinian content on the platform. We assess that content against our community standards, as we normally do, and we action it accordingly. That said, yes, there have been allegations, a number of big reports suggesting that material has been suppressed in various ways, or our efforts at addressing it have been overbroad and have had a disproportionate impact on that speech. And there's some truth to that. I will say that the Human Rights Policy Team, in fact, commissioned an independent piece of due diligence a number of years ago about how we treat content in Israel and Palestine, and it did raise a number of issues that were recommended to us to address. There are a couple of explanations for how some of this might have happened. One is drawing on that impact assessment is a difference between how robust our language classifiers are in Arabic versus Hebrew. They're not the same, and a unintended consequence of that, could be that we capture more pro-Palestinian speech than other speech. Another aspect of this is that we have a dangerous organizations and individuals policy. Hamas is a designated organization under that policy, which means that speech that is supporting or praising Hamas does get taken down. That does sometimes capture content that should be protected and kept on platform. And in the aftermath of October 7th and the violence in Gaza, we did make some other adjustments in accordance with crisis policy protocol and other protocols in the company that I'm no expert here, but that one way to say it is it lowered some of the certainty thresholds that our kind of artificial intelligence mechanisms have before in order to identify something as hate speech or as bullying and harassment or as potentially inciting language, and pulls it down. And that's something we do from time to time in crisis situations or where we think that the risk of offline violence is higher than normal. But a consequence of that can be that more content gets removed than would be taken down under other circumstances. There's lots to talk about on this topic, and I would direct you to a couple of things. Human Rights Watch did a report in December, which we responded to, and they've published that response as well as part of the report, and you can see that. There are also 2 posts on our website which lay out some of this in greater detail. The policy changes and efforts that we put into place after October 7th. That's not to say there isn't controversy around these. There's a lot, but from the human rights policy team side, we're engaged with civil society. We're engaged with UN bodies and other stakeholders to make sure that we do as good a job as we can in ensuring that politically protected speech remains on the platform, and that one group of people, particularly pro-Palestinian content, is not actioned at a greater rate than it should be. Particularly in these sorts of contexts, decisions, trade-offs are made no matter which way you go, whether you err on the side of taking down more content in order to minimize the potential for offline harm, or you protect more content in order to protect and promote political speech at a crucial moment like this. So I'll stop there. But
no, thank you.
To dig.
Thank you for giving that overview, and yeah, it's good to know that it's something that Meta has looked into, and we hope that it remains a neutral platform that's global in nature with users from all over the world, and there's certainly a lot of expectations around that. I'll move over to Mahmood Saab, but Nighat, I think you wanted to talk a bit about the oversight board's role.
No. I was just I was listening to Frederick, and it reminded me a couple of decisions that we basically gave, and the policy advisory opinion that Frederick must have looked into. It was on Shaheed term, which is the most over-enforced word on Meta's platform. And actually Meta reached out to us as a board that they are struggling with this issue and how to sort of look into the enforcement around Shaheed term. So we as a board did several stakeholder engagements around the world.
So sorry, if we could explain to the audience what was the issue with the word?
So basically शहीद का जो लफ्ज़ है वो मेटा के प्लेटफॉर्म पे जब बहुत से स्टेक होल्डर्स वर यूजिंग इट फॉर इंस्टेंस जर्नलिस्ट और मीडिया ऑर्गेनाइजेशन अपने अपने कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जैसे मिसाल के तौर पे अफगानिस्तान में जब इशू हुआ तो यू नो अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल वर यूजिंग शहीद वर्ड अराउंड तालिबान और जब व्हेन वी सी इट इन आवर ओन रीजन यू कश्मीर का इशू बुरहान वानी के साथ इस्तेमाल होता है एंड देन वी सॉ इट यू नो लाइक इन द करंट कॉन्फ्लिक्ट एज वेल एंड वी वर it took us a year to kind of you know like do a lot of deliberation on that term and sort of tell Meta that how they can deal with this particular issue. तो हमने एज अ बोर्ड उसको बहुत प्रॉपर तरीके से देखा डिफरेंट लोगों के साथ डिफरेंट रीजन्स में बात की एंड देन इशूड आवर पॉलिसी एडवाइजरी ओपिनियन जो कि मेटा के पास अब है एंड गेव सेवरल रिकमेंडेशंस टू देम कि किस तरीके से वो इससे डील कर सकते हैं बट ऑल्सो यू नो लाइक आई थिंक इट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर मेटा टू सी हाउ दे आर इम्प्लीमेंटिंग दोज रिकमेंडेशंस राइट सो I'm glad that Meta has an oversight board which can hold them accountable, and it's kind of unfortunate situation where I'm seeing this tweet, you know, posted by some activist yesterday, and it is now termed as hateful speech, right? And it is banned on Twitter. I'm not talking about Meta; it's on Twitter. But then, you know, you have no way to reach out to that platform. Their trust and safety teams are gone. Their human rights teams are gone. There's no one that you can escalate, you know, such kind of issues to these platforms. So what I'm trying to say is that Meta actually has a way to not only listening to their trusted partners, civil society organizations around the world, but also like if oversight board is giving their opinion or decisions and then there are like recommendations in there, they really need to look into this because that's like a oversight body, right? And they are doing it. I would say Al Shifa hospital pe bhi humne kiya hai current usme, that's an expedited case, and we actually asked Meta to look into their automated systems. Why people are, when they are posting something from the conflict zone, to unka content kyun demote ho raha hai and how their automated tools are actually acting when it comes to graphic and violent content.
Yeah, no, there's so much to be done in that sector for sure. Now, Mahmood Saab, I'll come to you, and you know, as Deputy Director of Cybercrime at FIA, of course, you have your plate full. There's a lot of complaints that the FIA receives from the government, from citizens, as well as, I'm assuming, from the government. I don't know how much you'll tell us about that. But we're curious. We're seeing a lot of, you know, enforcement and cases from the state and from society around disinformation. You know, under the cybercrime law, and they're using the Section 20 of PICA, and you know, especially in light of the Islamabad High Court judgment in 2022 April, in which Justice Athar Minallah said that the harm to reputation part has to be struck down and only the privacy part has to remain. But yet we see FIA continues to send notices to journalists, to activists, under that section and the harm to reputation part. So is there a reason for that? And then also if you could talk a bit about the capacity of FIA and you know what the FIA needs from the government in order to become a robust and efficient agency that caters to the needs of the most marginalized people in Pakistan, especially women, of children, of transgender people and others.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। सबसे पहले तो कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑर्गेनाइज़र का बहुत शुक्रिया कि आपने हमें अपॉर्चुनिटी दी, क्योंकि क्रिटिसिज्म हमें बहुत फेस करना पड़ता है लेकिन अपॉर्चुनिटी हमें बड़ी कम मिलती है कि हम किसी जगह पे बात कर सकें। बेसिकली थोड़ा सा मैं बैकग्राउंड बताऊं तो 2007 में FIA में साइबर क्राइम विंग स्टैब्लिश हुआ और देन उस टाइम पे जो हमारे पास अवेलेबल लॉ था वो एज ऑर्डिनेंस था, प्रिवेंशन ऑफ इलेक्ट्रॉनिक क्राइम ऑर्डिनेंस के तौर पर उसको हमने इन्फोर्स किया। बेसिकली ऑब्जेक्टिव्स भी जो साइबर क्राइम विंग का था वो जो लॉ इन्फोर्समेंट के तौर पर जो साइबर लॉज की इन्फोर्समेंट थी वो थे। पिका 2009 में जब ख़त्म हो गया देन फिर अगेन बड़ी डिबेट चली। मैं इस पूरी डिबेट में शायद पार्लियामेंट में भी सेनेट की जो कमेटीज़ थी उनमें पार्ट रहा हूँ। बहुत सारे लॉज शायद डिबेट उनके ऊपर हुई होगी लेकिन पिका के ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा डिबेट हुई। اب آپ خود اندازہ لگائیں کہ 2009 سے لے کے 2016 تک 100 سے زیادہ تو شاید میں نے جو ہے نا اٹینڈ کی ہوں گی میٹنگس. اصل میں آپ کو بتاؤں کیونکہ لائر بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں, آپ کو پتہ ہوگا کہ جب تک آپ کوئی بھی پولیس یا کوئی لا انفورسمنٹ کسی کیس میں یا کسی اوفینس میں کاگنیزنس نہیں لے سکتی تو ہم ایز اے لا انفورسمنٹ کہتے ہیں کہ ہمارے لیے لا بڑا ویک ہے. اور اس لا میں بھی پیکا میں اگر آپ دیکھیں تو سیکشن ٹوٹل جو اوفینسز ہیں وہ 25 اوفینسز ہیں, جن میں سے جسٹ 3 اوفینسز ایسے ہیں جن میں ہم ڈائریکٹ کاگنیزنس لے سکتے ہیں, باقی تمام اوفینسز نان کاگنیزیبل اوفینس ہیں. اب جہاں تک بات یہ ہوتی ہے کہ جو لوگ ہیں ہمارے پاس مین پاور ہے وہ تمام کے تمام جو ہے نا اسپیشلی کمپیوٹر جو ہے نا آئی ٹی سے لوگ ہیں, اور ہم نے خاص کر فیمیل کا بہت ہی مطلب فیئر کوٹا رکھا ہے, اور جتنی بھی فیمیل سے جتنی ریلیٹڈ کمپلینٹس ہوتی ہیں وہ فیمیل ہی بیسیکلی ہینڈل کرتی ہیں. اور پورے پاکستان میں ہمارے بیسیکلی پولیس اسٹیشنز ہیں. ہم نے پولیس اسٹیشن کا بھی نام, کیونکہ ہم تو ویسے بدنام بڑے ہو رہے ہیں, لیکن ہم نے کوشش اپنی طرف سے کرتے ہیں. ہم نے پولیس اسٹیشن بھی اپنا نام نہیں رکھا ہوا, ہم نے سائبر کرائم سرکل کے نام کے ساتھ ہم نے اس کو انٹروڈیوس کروایا, تاکہ تھوڑا سا ایک ہر بندے کے ذہن میں یہ آتا ہے کہ پولیس اسٹیشن ہم جائیں گے تو ہمارے ساتھ پتہ نہیں کیسا بیہیویئر ہوگا, تو ہم انکریج کرتے ہیں کمپلیننٹ کو. اسی وجہ سے ہمیں بیک 2023 میں اراؤنڈ کوئی 1,35,000 کمپلین ریسیو ہوئی ہیں. 2 سیکشن ہیں جس کے اوپر آج ڈیبیٹ ہو رہی ہے. ایک ہمارا سیکشن ہے 11 ہے جو ہیٹ اسپیچ سے ریلیٹڈ ہے, اور ایک سیکشن جو 20 ہے جس کے اوپر جو ڈس انفارمیشن اور فیک نیوز کے اوپر آیا. آپ نے بالکل رائٹلی کہا ہے کہ باقی جو مطلب جو افینس ہے اس میں جو ڈیفیمیشن سے ریلیٹڈ جتنی چیزیں تھیں وہ اسٹرک ڈاؤن ہو گئی ہیں, اور ہم نے چیلنج بھی نہیں کیا, اور وہ بیسیکلی جو ہے نا ایک لا بن گیا. اور ریسنٹلی بھی ابھی اگر آپ دیکھتے ہیں تو ہم پرائیویسی کے اوپر ہی جو ہمارے جو خاص کر ایک آپ کو شاید تھوڑا سا ایک چیز میں بتا دوں, ہم بیسیکلی کمپلینٹ بیس کام کرتے ہیں. مثلاً کوئی کمپلینٹ آتی ہے تو ہم نے اس کے اوپر ایکشن لیتا ہے. اور ایک اور بھی چیز میں کلیئر کر دوں کہ ہمارا نہ کوئی مانیٹرنگ کا میکینزم ہے, اور نہ ہمارے پاس یہ ڈومین ہے, اور نہ ہمارے پاس کوئی بلاکنگ کا سسٹم ہے, نہ ہی ہمارا یہ بلاکنگ کا ڈومین ہے. یہ بیسیکلی پی ٹی این ہے ڈومین, جو ڈومین ہے سیکشن 37 ہے اس میں پیکا, وہ ان کا کام ہے جو کرتے ہیں. ہاں یہ ضرور بات ہے کہ ہم بہت ساری جب کمپلینٹس آتی ہیں ہمیں کوئی بھی, تو ہم وہ کمپلینٹ ان کو فارورڈ کر دیتے ہیں, اور جنرل پبلک کی طرف سے نارملی وہ کمپلینٹس آتی ہیں. کیونکہ یہاں پہ اصل میں جو ڈس انفارمیشن کی بات ہے, ہم کچھ چیزوں کو نا بڑا اوور لک کر رہے ہوتے ہیں. اگر ہم اپنا لٹریسی ریٹ دیکھیں, اور خاص کر ڈیجیٹل لٹریسی ریٹ دیکھیں, تو بہت ہی کم ہے. ہم لوگ اکثر کہتے ہیں کہ ہماری بہت زیادہ جو ہے نا ڈس انفارمیشن بھی پھیل رہی ہے اور فیک نیوز بھی پھیل رہی ہے. اس کے پیچھے بہت بڑا ایک جو ہے نا بڑی جو ریزن ہے نا, وہ ریزن یہی ہے کہ ہمارا جو ڈیجیٹل لٹریسی ریٹ ہے نا وہ بہت کم ہے. بہت کم آرگنائزیشنز جو ہے نا اس کے اوپر کام کری ہے. میں نے ایک سروے کروایا, گریڈ 1 سے لے کے پی ایچ ڈی لیول تک کسی جگہ کے اوپر بیسٹ یوز آف ٹیکنالوجی ہمیں نہیں پڑھایا جا رہا, ہمارے بچوں کو نہیں پڑھایا جا رہا. اس کے لیے پھر ہم نے کوشش کی ہے, سائبر اسکاؤٹس کا ایک انیشیٹو جو ہے نا ہم لے کے آئے ہیں, جس میں جو ہے نا ہماری پوری کوشش تھی اور کوشش ہے کہ مختلف جو ہے نا اسکولز ہیں ان میں اپنے ٹرینرز ہم ڈپلائی کریں, جس کے تھرو آگے اپنے باقی اسکولز کے جو ہے نا اپنے بچوں کو ٹرین کریں. آپ کو پتہ ہے ہماری بڑی لمیٹڈ سی فورس ہے پورے پاکستان میں, اور کمپلینٹس جیسے میں نے بتایا کہ 1,35,000 اگر پر ایئر آتی ہیں تو بہت زیادہ ہوتی ہے. سیکشن جو 11 ہیٹ اسپیچ کے اوپر میں آپ کو بتاؤں, ہم بہت زیادہ کیئر کرتے ہیں. آپ اس سے اندازہ لگائیے کہ اراؤنڈ کوئی 3,500 لاسٹ ایئر ہمیں کمپلینٹس ریسیو ہوئی ہیں, اور جس میں سے جسٹ 55 کمپلینٹس کے اگینسٹ ہم نے ایف آئی آر لانچ کیا ہے, باقی کسی کے اگینسٹ بھی ہم نے ایف آئی آر لانچ نہیں کی. تھرڈلی جو ہم سمن کی بات کرتے ہیں, ہراس کرنے کی بات کرتے ہیں, آپ اگر سیکشن 20 کے پڑھیں تو اس میں جو ورڈز لکھے ہوئے ہیں کہ کوئی بھی بات آپ ایسی کرتے ہیں جس کو آپ پروو نہیں کر سکتے تو وہ آفینس ہے بیسیکلی. اب آپ اندازہ لگائیں, دیکھیں ہم کوئی ایف آئی آر نہیں کر رہے ہوتے, ہم اگر کوئی بندہ کسی کے بارے میں کوئی الج کرتا ہے یا کوئی اس کے اوپر ایلیگیشن لگاتا ہے,
معذرت کے ساتھ قانون میں یہ تو کہیں نہیں لکھا کہ اپروو نہیں کر سکتے, پیکا کے قانون میں سیکشن 20 میں
آپ لاء میں بڑا کیٹیگری کہ کوئی بھی ایسا ایلیگیشن جو آپ کہ پروو نہیں کریں گے. مثال کے طور میں کسی کے اوپر ایلیگیشن لگاتا ہوں کہ یہ کرپٹ ہے, تو اگر میرے پاس کوئی ایویڈنس ہے اس کے کرپشن کے تو پھر وہ اوفینس نہیں بنتا. لیکن اگر اس کے میں پروو نہیں کر پاتا ہوں کہ وہ جو ہے نا اس نے کرپشن کیا تو دین یہ آفینس بنتا ہے. اسی لیے جو پہلا سٹیپ ہے ہم جو کام کرتے ہیں, جب سمن کرتے ہیں, اور سمن بھی آپ ہمارا پڑھیے گا, وہ ایون جو ہے نا آنریبل ہائی کورٹ کی جو ڈائریکشن کے اوپر اور ان کے جو آرڈر سے اس کی کمپلائنس میں وہ ہم نے جو سمنز ہیں وہ ڈرافٹ کیے, اور اس ڈرافٹنگ میں بھی کہیں بھی کسی طرح سے اگر آپ اس کی ورڈنگ پڑھیں گے تو آپ کو فیل ہوگا کہ ہم تو صرف اتنا لکھتے ہیں کہ آپ نے یہ جو انفارمیشن آپ نے جو پبلک کی ہے, اس انفارمیشن کے بارے میں آپ کے پاس کوئی ایویڈنس اویلیبل ہے تو آپ ہمیں پرووائڈ کریں. اصل میں اس کو پورا کمیونٹی میں اکثر لوگوں کو دیکھتا ہوں کہ اس کو یہی سمجھا جاتا ہے کہ ہراس کرنا ہوتا ہے. میرا خیال ہے کیونکہ دیکھیں ایف آئی آر تو کوئی ہو نہیں رہی, یا نہ کوئی ہم کوئی کرمنل کیس اس کے اوپر انیشیٹ اب بھی کر رہے ہیں. ہم تو جسٹ اتنا ظاہری بات ہے, کمپلینٹ آتی ہے, کمپلینٹ کے اوپر ہم اتنا ضرور کہتے ہیں کہ جی جس بندے کے خلاف اگر کوئی ایلیگیشن کسی نے کیا ہوا ہے تو اس ایلیگیشن کو ہم وہ بندہ اگر پروو کر لیتا ہے تو دین اینڈس وہاں پہ مطلب چیزیں کلوز ہو جاتی ہیں اور باقی آگے ایف آئی آرز وغیرہ نہیں ہوتی.
Ji, thank you for shedding light on, you know, what the FI is doing. And of course, I think capacity کے بہت زیادہ ایشوز ہیں, لیکن پولیٹیکل ول کا بھی مسئلہ ہے کہ جب خواتین جاتی ہیں ایف آئی کے دفتر ہمارے پاس اور نگہت وغیرہ کے پاس, بہت زیادہ ایسی خواتین آتی ہیں, جرنلسٹ ہوں گی یا ایوری ڈے بچیاں ہوتی ہیں جن کی تصاویر کا غلط استعمال کیا جاتا ہے, تو ان کے کیسز کو ہم دیکھتے ہیں ایف آئی ایسی ترجیح نہیں دیتی جتنا وہ اسد طور کے کیس کو دیتی ہے یا کسی اور صحافی کے کیس کو.
نہیں ایسی بات نہیں ہے. دیکھیں سیکشن 21 ہے ہمارا, جس میں ہمارا فیمیل سے ریلیٹڈ جتنے بھی ایشوز ہوتے ہیں اس کو ہم ایڈریس کرتے ہیں. میں نے جیسے آپ کو پہلے بتایا کہ ہمارے جتنے بھی سینٹرز ہیں ہم نے فیمیل جو کیا نام ہے جتنی امپلائیز ہیں ہماری وہ فیمیلز ہیں, اور فیمیل ہی اس کے کیس کو ٹیکل کرتی ہیں, کوئی بھی میلز اس کو ٹیکل نہیں کرتا. اور میرا خیال ہے شاید مجھے تو کوئی ایسا مطلب نہیں لگتا کہ کسی کیس میں اس طرح ہوا ہو کہ فیمیل کو کسی کیس میں ہم نے یہ نہ کہا, اس کو پراپرلی انٹرٹین نہ کیا ہو. ایون ہم جو انکوائری جو کیسز ہیں ہم نے انکوائری جو سٹیج ہوتی ہے, اگر کوئی ایویڈنس اویلیبل ہو اس کے پاس امیجیٹ اویلیبل ہو, اگر فرینزی کی ضرورت ہے تو ہم انکوائری سٹیج کے اوپر ہی ایف آئی آر لانچ کر دیتے ہیں. تو کوشش ہماری یہ ہوتی ہے کہ اس کو جتنا جلدی ہم جو ایز پر لا جو پروسیڈنگز ہیں اس کو ہم کمپلیٹ کریں.
نہیں محمود صاحب, امید ہے کہ ایف آئی ایک ایسا ادارہ بنے جس میں کوئی بھی آرام سے جا سکے, محفوظ طریقے سے کمپلین دے سکے اور ان کے کمپلین پہ جو ہے ایکشن لی جائے. We have around 10-15 minutes left, so, and Frederick's also here with us, Mahmood Saab is here, Nighat's here, so we'll open the floor for questions. Maybe I'll take a few together so that then we can offer the panelists the opportunity to respond. I'll just request that you make your question brief and direct, and I'll also request the panelists to, you know, give a as brief response as possible so that we can take in as many as we can. Ji Rukhsana Saiba, sorry if there can be a mic so that even online participants can hear.
Because she's done a fantastic job for us. Congratulations. I follow you as much as I can. Why hasn't PICA been amended as yet? There are certain laws which have got flaws in them. We have had a whole series of member of parliaments here, the Minister of Law. Ma'am, where's the flaw? Should we pro bono file petitions in the Sindh High Court in Punjab? What kind of pressure do you want? Please feel free.
We didn't introduce you properly. Ms. Rukhsana was a judge also in Sindh, former judge, not currently, and of course a lawyer as well. So thank you for your question. Maybe we can take a couple of more questions, and then we can offer the opportunity for response. Ji, yahan pe ek de dein aur wahan pe bhi ek.
السلام علیکم. میرا کوشچن محمود صاحب سے ہے. میں جام شورو سندھ سے ہوں. میں نے پرسنلی ایک کمپلین کی تھی سائبر کرائم میں, اور میرا کافی ہاٹ ایشو چلا تھا صرف پاکستان بار تک. آج تک اس پر نوٹس ایشو نہیں ہوئے. 2021 سے لے کے 2024 آ گیا. تو آپ یہ کیسے اتنی شورٹی سے کہتے ہیں کہ وومن کے ساتھ انصاف ہو رہا ہے؟ ایون کہ مجھے پریکٹس میں 12 سال ہو گئے, میرے ساتھ ابھی تک انصاف نہیں ہوا, تو باقی وومن کا کیا حال ہوگا؟ تھینک یو سو مچ.
دیکھیں میں تو کبھی یہ بھی نہیں کہوں گا کہ ہم اتنے پرفیکٹ ہو گئے ہیں یا مطلب بالکل عبدو دی بہار کا
آپ کی بات انٹرپٹ کر رہی ہوں. وومن امپلائی ہونا نہیں ہوتا.
دیکھیں
میں اس بات کہ اگر آپ نے وومن امپلائیز رکھی ہیں تو انصاف ہوگا, اس لیے کہ وہ وومن ہے وہاں پر, ایسا
سوری,
نہیں ہے.
ان کو موقع دے دیں جواب کا,
اچھا.
پھر ادھر میرے خیال سے ایک اور سوال
پہل
ہے.
اچھا
جی.
Assalamu alaikum. So this is a question for Frederick. We know there are studies done that show marginalized groups experience a disproportionate amount of hate speech on social media, on various platforms, including Meta, X, and so on. So what distinguishes free speech from hate speech, and how is this prevented? And what is being done to limit the impact on marginalized communities?
Thank you. And this is perfect because we have one question from each panelist, so we can go in order. And Nighat, please. And sorry, if you could please keep it a bit
I'll
brief.
keep it very brief. With regards to Pika, I think there is a lack of political will. That's what we have seen for the last several years during PMLN's regime, and then there was PTI regime, and now we again have PMLN and other governments. And I think it's the lack of political will. It's they keep raising it when they are in opposition, when they come back into the government. I think वो पूरा वो जो जोश जज्बा है वो एकदम से उनका मिट्टी की तरह बैठ जाता है. तो वो and we don't know कि क्या वजह है कि वो क्यों नहीं पीका में प्रॉपर अमेंडमेंट्स लेकर के आ रहे. और अगर लेकर के what we are basically saying कि we need cyber crime law. हमने तो कभी कहा ही नहीं है कि हमें cyber crime law या legal regime नहीं चाहिए. What we are saying is कि उस लॉ के अंदर प्रोटेक्शंस लोगों के लिए लेकर आए, और उसके साथ साथ डेटा प्रोटेक्शन की भी रिजीम लेकर आए. हम लोग कितना साइबर क्राइम के हवाले से चले एक लॉ इन्फोर्समेंट बॉडी है, बट देन अगर लोगों का पूरा डेटा लीक हो रहा है, इलेक्शन के दौरान आपकी पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज ने वोटर्स का डेटा इस्तेमाल किया, एंड पीपल एक्चुअली हैव नो आइडिया कहाँ से उनका डेटा किसके पास गया और कैसे उनको कॉल्स आ रही हैं, एंड हु इज़ यूजिंग व्हाट, एंड व्हाई वी आर सीइंग नादरा की डेटाबेस जो है वो हर वक्त ब्रीच होती रहती है. सो आई थिंक देयर लाइक ऑल दीज प्रोटेक्शन रिजीम्स रेगुलेटरी जो हमें चाहिए, एंड डेफिनेटली अ पॉलिटिकल विल टू एक्चुअली मेक दिस लॉ बेटर, बिकॉज द लॉ इज उसकी फाउंडेशन ही बहुत गलत है.
महमूद साहब.
क्वेश्चन है, मैं तो ये बिल्कुल नहीं कहूँगा कि हम बिल्कुल परफेक्ट है हो गए हैं या हमारी जो सर्विसेज हैं अप टू मार्क हैं. डेफिनेटली किसी जगह पे कुछ इश्यूज़ ज़रूर होंगे. अच्छा, एक चीज़ मैं आपको ज़रूर बताऊँ, क्योंकि हमारा साइबर से रिलेटेड है और डिजिटल एविडेंस के ऊपर हम सारा पूरे का पूरा बेस कर रहे होते हैं, तो अक्सर और बेशतर जो कंप्लेंट्स होती हैं वो उसमें क्योंकि एविडेंस का जो अवेलेबिलिटी है, जो डिजिटली जिस फॉर्म में उस वो नहीं होती, जिसकी वजह से हमारे अक्सर केसेस में इश्यूज़ आते हैं, डिले और ज़रूर होते हैं. क्योंकि हमें ज़ाहिर बात है कोर्ट ऑफ लॉ में जब जानना है तो विद एविडेंस जानना होता है कि एविडेंस अवेलेबल है या नहीं है. तो कुछ लोगों, क्योंकि आजकल ख़ासकर जिस तरह व्हाट्सएप पे बहुत सारे इश्यूज़ हैं कि वन टाइम व्यू वाले इशू है कि एक बंदे ने बहुत सारी पिक्चर्स किस जगह पे अब कर फॉरवर्ड कर दी और वो वन टाइम व्यू से सारी डिलीट हो गई, तो फिर मुश्किल होता है इसको कोर्ट ऑफ लॉ में जाके प्रूव करना कि इस तरह की चीज़ें हुई हैं, पब्लिकली जो है ना एग्जिबिट हुई हैं. तो इस तरह के मे भी इशू ज़रूर हों. सेकेंडली जो फ़ीमेल की बात हो रही थी वो बेसिकली सिर्फ इसलिए थी कि जो ये नहीं मैं कहता हूँ कि उसमें जो उनको बहुत ज़्यादा इंसाफ फ़ीमेल की वजह से मिल जाएगा, लेकिन हमने थोड़ा सा इसलिए उस फीमेल्स को इनकरेज करते हैं कि ताकि कंप्लेंट करने के लिए लोग आएँ. मतलब फ़ीमेल्स हमारे यहाँ बेसिकली बिल्कुल रवायात पहले नहीं थी, अब तो बहुत ज़्यादा है कि जो हमारे पुलिस स्टेशन में फ़ीमेल्स विज़िट करती हैं. तो इसमें तो डेफिनेटली कोई ना कोई लैक हमारे एंड पे होगा. मैं ये बिल्कुल कभी भी नहीं कहूँगा कि ऐसा नहीं हो सकता, लेकिन मे भी कुछ ना कुछ ऐसे एविडेंस ना हों जिसकी वजह से मे भी इतना टाइम लग सकता हो. अदरवाइज़ तो
एक मिनट महमूद साहब, यहाँ पे बहुत सारे ऐसे इदारे मौजूद हैं जो FIA की मदद कर सकते हैं. जेंडर सेंसिटाइजेशन में अगर स्टाफ की ट्रेनिंग है, आई नो ऑलरेडी DRF, AGHS या इनकी तरफ से कोलैबोरेशंस होती भी रहते हैं. तो मेरे ख्याल से इस किस्म की पार्टनरशिप भी FIA के साथ होनी चाहिए, जहाँ एक तो वी कैन शेयर रिसर्च विथ यू कि किस तरह के केसेस आ रहे हैं, एंड देन मे बी हेल्प ट्रेन स्टाफ ताकि ये जो मसले हैं then they can be addressed.
हम तो बिल्कुल वेलकम करेंगे, हर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को वेलकम करते हैं और बड़े ओपन हार्टली हम कहते हैं कि हमें देखें कोई भी ख़ास कर जिस तरह का सिनेरियो क्रिएट हो रहे हैं, जिस तरह हमारे यहाँ देखें, अगर आप थोड़े से फिगर्स देखें तो 2029 से और 2022 में कोई अराउंड 100% से भी ज़्यादा जो हमारा इंटरनेट का यूज़ हो गया है। तो अब ये कोई कहे कि जी एज आ मतलब लॉ इन्फोर्समेंट हम चीज़ों को सारी चीज़ों को हैंडल कर लेंगे, ये नामुमकिन सी बात है। ये एज आ जो है ना तमाम स्टेक होल्डर्स, तमाम ऑर्गेनाइजेशन मिल के काम करेंगी। ख़ासकर जो डिजिटल जो लिटरेसी है उसको हम बहुत ज़्यादा इम्प्रूवमेंट करने की ज़रूरत है। उसमें जब तक इम्प्रूवमेंट नहीं आएगी शायद हम कोई भी शायद एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन कोई भी इस चीज़ को जो है ना कभी भी नहीं फाइट कर सकते इस पूरे साइबर क्राइम इश्यूज़ को।
बिल्कुल।
So I just want to add कि ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो डिजिटल राइट्स पे हैं वो काफ़ी अपना किरदार अदा भी कर रही हैं डिजिटल लिटरेसी के मामले में। मुख्तलिफ जगहों पे जाके स्कूल, कॉलेजेस, यूनिवर्सिटीज़, आपने देखा ही होगा कि डिजिटल राइट्स फाउंडेशन की तरफ से जो साइबर हरासमेंट हेल्पलाइन है, हम लोग आप लोगों के पास केसेस भी लेकर आते हैं और बहुत से केसेस में ख़वातीन को जस्टिस मिला भी है। आई थिंक जो हम लोगों ने आइडेंटिफाई किया है वो मसला ये है कि साइबर क्राइम विंग में रिसोर्सेज की काफ़ी कमी है और जो कांस्टेंट एक फॉर इंस्टेंस एक प्लान होता है कि हमने साइबर क्राइम विंग को यूं बिल्ड करना है। आई थिंक वो एक कमी है महमूद साहब कि 10 साल प्लान क्या है साइबर क्राइम विंग का, और क्या ये जो ऑफिसेज हैं वो अब ज़्यादा हो गए हैं, 5-6 शहरों से निकल के हो सकता है 15 शहरों में चले गए हों, लेकिन पूरे मुल्क में जब ये मसाइल हैं और फोरेंसिक्स के हवाले से भी आप लोगों की जो कैपेसिटी आई थिंक उसको बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ाने की ज़रूरत है। अब एआई, जनरेटिव एआई, डीप फेक के हवाले से उसको किस तरीके से डील किया जाएगा, आई थिंक दैट्स अ वेरी वैलिड क्वेश्चन जो लॉ इन्फोर्समेंट के हवाले से।
Sorry. Just there's a question for Frederick also from Saqib. About hate speech and free speech, right? And hate speech impacting vulnerable people the most. So it'd be great, Frederick, if you could please shed light on that. And sorry,
Sure.
just for a bit of context, there's a lot of discussion in Urdu, but we were talking about the investigation capacities related to cybercrime cases. So I thought I'll let you know because it was in Urdu. Thank you.
Thank you, and apologies for not having understanding that bit of the conversation. Once again, of course, this is a very complex topic, but the easiest way for me to answer that question is to literally read from our hate speech policy, which is based very much on the concept of protected characteristics. So we say we define hate speech as a direct attack against people rather than concepts or institutions on the basis of what we call protected characteristics: race, ethnicity, national origin, disability, religious affiliation, caste, sexual orientation, sex, gender identity, and serious disease. That means our internal systems for identifying hate speech and deciding when to action it are very much based on attacks upon those characteristics. In addition to that, we have other policies that get at vulnerable and marginalized groups. We have separate policies on refugees and migrants, on age, on human rights defenders. And again, I mentioned that we take a very broad definition of that. The problem is, how do you operationalize this? There are lots of ways to do it. None of them are perfect, but we have, for instance, what we call slur lists, which are context-specific sets of lists of keywords and those sorts of things that help us to identify when speech is likely to be targeted at a vulnerable group and is likely to be in violation of one or more of our policies.
And sorry, this is AI powered?
Yeah. So, okay. Well, here's a good. I'll end with a statistic from my little fact sheet I have for myself here. But before I do that, we'll say we also look at harmful stereotypes. We look at proxy words. There are lots of things. But yes, the challenge is, how do you identify this speech and take action against it without overreaching and taking down a lot of speech that you don't want to take down at scale? And this is the fundamental question when it comes to social media, something I didn't appreciate myself until I joined Meta, which is that you need quote unquote scalable solutions. I mean, just looking at the statistics from April to June of 2023, you can see this on our Transparency Center. We actioned 17 million pieces of content that we found to be violating our hate speech policies. 89% of that was identified proactively by AI tools and actioned without any human involvement. So that gives you a sense of the scale. And hate speech is in most periods, 0.01% ish of the speech that's on the platform. So we're talking about most of that being actioned through automated systems. But again, that's a challenge. That means it's one thing to talk about the robot principles or the principles to contextualize speech and action it into the right and appropriate circumstances. That's easy for me to understand as a human rights lawyer or a judge to apply, or perhaps the oversight board to apply in its deliberations. But it's another thing to turn that into code that an engineer will build into a language classifier that will then operate in some level of accuracy across potentially, hundreds of languages. So, but I would direct you to the Transparency Center for data on what we've done in this domain, and for the policies themselves, which are pretty robust and pretty detailed. And you can find a lot more about some of the factors that are taken into account in making those decisions. Thanks.
No, we appreciate that with Meta's 3 billion user base, it must be super challenging, right? Moderating all of the content. But because Meta, obviously is processing a lot of data of users, there's those responsibilities as well. So the use of AI is very helpful. And we just hope that more local context is taken into account when these standards are enforced. So for example, languages like Urdu or Pashto or Balochi or Sindhi, we see that the enforcement is not as efficient as it is in English. And of course, that's a challenge for companies the world over as to how they're going to deal with that. So thank you very much to all our panelists. And just before we close, is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? Or, okay, great, perfect. So we're ending at time. Saqib, you have a follow-up question?
I have a follow-up question, sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
So Frederick, you talked about that your community guidelines are based on individuals and identities and protected identities. And you said it's not towards institutions. So then thinking about specific definitions, so let's say the definition of anti-Semitism, how do you then explain anti-Semitism versus the criticism of Israel?
What I'll say is we have, it's true that our the hate speech policy that I just read is in part defined as an attack upon an individual. We do have other policies that seek to get at this issue. We, for instance, have a policy that seeks, where we have enough information and context, to set some parameters about how we can identify attacks upon concepts, beliefs, ideas, institutions that are associated with protected characteristics that could contribute to offline harm or intimidation or other forms of harm. So there is a set of there is a framework in place for us to do that, but we approach this with great caution, because once you get into this domain, you really get into the domain of, you really raise dangers of touching upon what we would think of as protected speech. And in the context you're raising, of course, I'm not going to get into it right now because it deserves a detailed discussion. But when you get into discussions around proxy words, phrases, slogans, characterizations of communities of people, you need to be very careful about drawing up a policy that's going to take down a lot of what could be protected speech. But we do have a framework for that. We call that kind of people versus concepts, and we try our best with some useful input from the various decisions of the oversight board, in fact, to think about how we can incorporate some of the international law principles, particularly the guidance in the Rabat Plan of Action, into that process.
Thank you.
But I will leave it at that for now. But acknowledging that you've touched upon a complex topic that deserves its own panel discussion, in fact.
Yeah, so just to sum up, in our discussion on online hate speech and disinformation, We've covered regulatory issues that we're seeing that comes to states. So for example, in Pakistan, what laws do we have? What are the issues with it? And sort of how can we fix it? And that's a very big claim. But in the resolution, we'll include a lot of what we discussed here. We've also talked about enforcement by social media companies on human rights standards when it comes to hate speech and disinformation, especially in light of vulnerable communities of gender and sexual minorities. We've also talked about the capacity of the government and of law enforcement agencies and how they can investigate issues, how can they improve, and what is it that they need in order to cater to us better. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that we're becoming increasingly digital. The Pakistani population today in 2024, more than half of the population now is connected to the internet, and the majority of which uses social media. And as a tool and as a platform for furthering democracy, social media has become critical. So the right to freedom of expression is, of course, the bedrock of democracy and, of course, the bedrock of fundamental rights, because if you can't speak about violation of human rights, then how do you protect them, right? And in that context, I think what we're seeing from the state is efforts to regulate social media, but how are they regulating it? They're trying to, criminalize speech. So I think Pakistan needs to move towards decriminalization of speech. So, and I think over 90 countries around the world, if I'm not wrong, have decriminalized speech. But in Pakistan, you can still go to jail for merely making a speech, for tweeting or putting up a TikTok video or a Facebook post. And I think that's a huge tragedy. That's something, we need to work towards decriminalization of speech in general. We've also seen that the courts have stepped in and the courts have said, you cannot, criminalize defamation. So they struck down part of Section 20, but the government is still using it. We've also seen courts strike down the sedition laws, which is a colonial law that sort of, says that, mutiny against the state is anything that's critical of state policy. And especially when it comes to, sensitive institutions like the judiciary or the military, if you speak about them, it's a ticket to jail, right? So I think these are things that we need to have broader conversations around, where we need to put in protections in the law, and we need to also look at how vulnerable communities are impacted disproportionately by hate speech and disinformation, and how civil society, governments, and companies can work together to sort of make this environment one where it's not suffocating, and one environment where you can speak freely with responsibility, but there should also be, proportionate consequences for a speech that is harmful and that puts others in danger. So I think treading that part is the main challenge. And if any last words from our panelists, you're welcome to pitch in.
I think just a very brief comment. It's not only rights issue. It's a right to financial independence issue as well. So we are deterring investments in Pakistan while bringing lots of regulatory, while पूरा पाकिस्तान रेगुलेशन से बहुत भरा हुआ है. एंड आई थिंक जो इंटरनेशनल कंपनीज इन्वेस्टर्स हैं हम लोग उनको डिटर कर रहे हैं. एंड आई थिंक दैट्स व्हाट वी रियली नीड टू अवॉइड, बिकॉज इट्स नॉट ओनली इंडिविजुअल्स यूजर्स राइट, बट ऑल्सो कंपनीज आर एक्चुअली अवॉइडिंग एंड आर हेजिटेंट टू कम टू पाकिस्तान फॉर investment.
And that impacts the right to livelihood. Yeah. So if people can't access TikTok or Twitter or YouTube, a lot of people use it for their businesses. A lot of people are content creators and they're impacted. So hopefully we'll continue to raise our voices on this. Thank you very much, Frederick, for joining us online all the way and for giving time and for, honestly asking a lot of the questions. And I hope, Meta will also take the feedback from this discussion for further improvement in enforcement of human rights policy. Thank you, Mahmood Saab, for joining us and for telling us what the issues are, and hopefully the feedback from here will also help the FIA improve. And thank you, Nighat, for joining us and telling us about where the issues lie. And because of your work internationally at the Oversight Board and with the AI regulation, we hope that a lot of this discussion will aid in that also. And lastly, thank you to all of you who sat with us, who were part of a discussion, and for your very thoughtful questions. Thank you.